So let's talk about a brief history of state management libraries for React. So whenever I started working on React, Redux was a go-to option for managing state in a React app. But now there are many other libraries and patterns for managing state. Each of them make bold claims as to why they are the best. So I thought I would try several of them to see what the fuss is about. And let's start with the next one. One of React's defining features is its one-way data binding. With it, we don't have to manage the DOM manually. We can change the props or the state of React components, and React will automatically calculate the markup and update the DOM to display it in the browser. React does not have any restrictions on how you can use the state. This leaves you in charge of using state in a manageable way, and that is a tricky thing to do, especially when you are not familiar with React and when the app grows beyond a few components. In the first React app I built, I did not think about how I was using the state. I used it whenever and wherever I needed it, and passed values through components to whichever place I needed them. It was a mess. So now come Flux. A year after React was initially announced and open sourced at JSConf 2013, Facebook introduced the Flux architecture for React apps. Instead of directly updating state values, Flux advocated for sending actions via dispatchers to stores, and that can be found to different bound not found that can be bound to different components. That's called views. This way components only needed to read and update the store instead of changing other component state. So this is what a Flux architecture does. So here comes the shortly afterward and the main part of the player, Redux. Dan Abramov was looking for ways to improve the developer experience of building React apps. After building React hot loader for view changes to React code without refreshing the browser, he discovered that it didn't work with Flux. So he built his own implementation. While doing so, he simplified the Flux patterns by having reducers instead of dispatchers, and stores and a single reducer instead of several stores. This was Redux, reducers plus Flux. Now we come to MobX, previously Mobservable. Around the same time, Michael Westrat was starting work on a visual editor. He was not happy with React's performance when thousands of elements had to be updated simultaneously. To solve this issue, he turned to observables, which was a concept used by several other UI frameworks. By default, React re-renders all the child components whenever a component state changes. By making the data model observable, components could observe and update only when specific part of the data model changed. Eventually, he released his implementation of observables as a library called Mobservables. This later became MobX: action, observable state, derived values, reactions. MobX were the earliest state management library for React. Of the two, Redux became the de facto standard for managing state in a React app. Why? Perhaps because Redux was based on Flux, which was endorsed by Facebook, and because the Flux library was more like a proof of concept. Since Redux advocated for storing the entire application state inside a single Redux store, everything from API responses to form inputs and user preferences were stored and managed using Redux. One of the most disliked aspects of Redux was the amount of boilerplate code it required. To add a new piece of state in Redux, you need to write or create an action type, an action creator, a new entry in the reducer, and a new selector. Fetching data from an API required even more boilerplate since each state of the operation, that is loading, success, error, required each of the above. Coming to Relay, when Facebook introduced Relay in 2015, they introduced a new way of React component to declaratively state the data they required. You could write a GraphQL query, bind it to a component, and let Relay handle the process of loading it without writing the logic yourself. It allowed query results to be cached so that the data could be shared across several components without another trip to the server. So Relay provided many features that would had to be implemented manually on Redux. It kick-started a new class of libraries for React that handle data fetching and submission. With them, the amount of state that had to be managed manually reduces substantially. A short example you can see here. Suppose there is a user story which extends a React component. You have a container and you can create a container, relay.create container story, and the fragments will come as the fragments on story. There is a QL language of a GraphQL. What will be the text? How the author, what's the author name and photo. React hooks, the next major change to state management libraries, came from the introduction of React hooks in 2019. Hooks provided a way to share stateful logic across components. Until now, state management used higher order components to interact with components. Okay, many eventually switched to using hooks, but several hook centric alternatives also appeared, like Justang, Recoil, Jotai, and Valchio. Soon after, the Redux team also introduced a Redux toolkit to help developers use Redux with less boilerplate code. And with this, we will look at the other libraries next, and let's see what happens. Like Justang has a flux pattern, XState has state machines, Jotai has a Jotai has atomic state, Valchio has a proxy state, MobXR works with observable signals with signals. So Preact signals we will be working on more. And yep, that's it. See you next week.